Welcome to a very special episode of Brain and Bat. We're delighted to be rejoined by Kianpour, and we're going to be talking about the philosophy of humor. Jason isn't going to be joining us today, and instead we have a very special guest, Stephen Kershnar, one of our favorite guests on the show, and he's going to be a guest host. Connor, would you like to start with a thought experiment?
Yeah, thanks for having me back on again. So I'd like you to imagine that there is a cake making competition and people are trying to find a judge that would help adjudicate the gustatory merits of the cakes in the competition. And you come across a woman named Alice, who she's averse to sweets. She hates anything that's saccharine, and you ask her to be a judge of this cake making competition. I think that a lot of people would think that it's inappropriate to ask Alice to be a judge of this cake making competition, given that she's not able to appreciate the kind of food that cake is. And so it's my thought that this thought experiment gives us some insight about how we should assess the aesthetic value of immoral jokes. So those who are offended or angered or disgusted by immoral jokes are relevantly similar to Alice in the sense that Alice lacks the capacity to appreciate the kind of art that she's being asked to appreciate. And that's also the case with the individual who's angered or offended or disgusted by immoral jokes, given that they're not able to feel amused by those jokes. So we shouldn't really place significant weight on the aesthetic judgments of individuals who claim that because a joke is offensive or angers them or disgusts them, that the joke is less aesthetically valuable.
So what I like about your case is that it raises this tension between whether there's an objective standard for what makes something good or whether things are merely a matter of taste. So we could say there are certain things in the universe that tell you whether a cake is better or worse than another cake. Or it could be that someone says, look, I like sweet things, you like sour things, there's no fact of the matter, and it's really this matter of preference. But that if we're trying to work out whether this is a good, sweet object, it seems like a bad idea to ask someone who finds sweet things repugnant. That you want to ask people that are that have the same taste, whether the thing is worth having. You think about how a lot of recommendation engines work, things like Spotify or YouTube or Netflix, basically say, given that you have this taste and other people have a similar taste to you, we recommend that you watch this. We're not making a claim that it's objectively better. We're just telling you, you're probably going to like this because of the taste. So what I wonder about with dark humor, is it just a matter of taste? Are there some objective reasons to think that dark humor is good or bad aesthetically or morally?
Yeah, great question. So it's my thought that the claim that, I guess, let me first get clear on the sort of claim that I'm making with respect to the relationship between moral defects and the aesthetic value of jokes. So the way that I understand a moral defect in a joke is that a joke either punches down on a group of socially vulnerable people, and that's counts as a morally defective joke. A joke might cause bad consequences by senselessly offending or angering individuals. That would make a joke morally defective. Or a joke could be claimed to reveal a defect in character of the person who's telling the joke. And that could also make a joke count as morally defective. And so my claim is that anytime a moral defect crops up in a joke in the ways that I just understood it, that there is an artistic risk that is being undertaken by the joke teller, such that the norms that are governing the aesthetic enterprise of joke telling are being challenged by the morally defective character of the jokes in question. So I think that it's pretty plausible to think that in general, when artists take aesthetic risks or take certain kinds of artistic risks with respect to their art form, that challenges the conventions that govern that art form, that it's not unreasonable to think that aesthetic value would accrue to the artwork that challenges the conventions governing that art form. And so my thought is that morally defective jokes, the reason we have to think that they are aesthetically enhanced in virtue of their moral defects is because the moral defects challenge the conventions of comedy in certain kinds of ways. And that's why we should think that aesthetic value accrues to all of them. So going back to your sort of distinction that you made between objective aesthetic value and mere matters of taste, it's totally consistent on my view to acknowledge that a lot of people who do not have a taste for immoral humor, they do no wrong by dispreferring it necessarily, but that if they were to claim that these sorts of demonstrations lack aesthetic value, that claim is incorrect.
So if I could just follow up, so implicit in your discussion seems to be the idea that humor value is objective, or at least you're open to that theory. And I think there's good reasons to reject that. And if we reject that, I'm wondering what this does to your overall approach. So here are just 3 reasons. One is the kind of standard accounts as to why we think that something is humorous. Things like superiority, when the joke teller is superior to the person who the joke's told about, incongruity, 2 things don't go together, relief somehow releases pressure, or play, that joke involves play. All these things involve the sort of subjective interaction between people. They don't seem to suggest some sort of objective value. The second reason is that if the humor value is objective, then why isn't coolness or sexiness objective? And I don't think they are. No offense to the Fonz. I would never offend the Fonz. And then third, of the sort of like the basis, like what the thing is that's objectively funny is just never clear to me. Is it the joke itself? The joke would be funny even if there were no people in the world? Or is it the joke is funny because these people exist in the world? If it's the latter, which it pretty clearly is, this does not look like an objective value. So I guess I just don't see humor as being objectively valuable, in part because of the basis standardly given for it, in part because of coolness and sexiness, and in part just because I don't know what it is that's objectively funny.
I'll start my response by first canvassing some different views about what makes jokes funny, and then maybe trying to, in so doing, push back on the claim that all of these candidates are like subjective in character. So some different accounts of humor that have been defended in the literature. So there are people like Kant and Schopenhauer who subscribe to an incongruity theory of humor. The thought behind the incongruity theory is that things are humorous to the extent that they subvert expectations. But there's a problem with understanding the incongruity theory in a certain kind of way. So if you were to say that any time a demonstration is incongruous, that is sufficient for imbuing the demonstration with humor, that just seems implausible from the get-go. It seems like there are a lot of things that would subvert expectations, like, for example, if somebody were to drop a bomb on my apartment, but that wouldn't be necessarily a funny thing, at least from my perspective. So there's the incongruity theory, but there does seem to be something to the thought that many, if not all, humorous demonstrations involve incongruity of some kind. And I'll put a pin in that for the moment and return to it when discussing a different theory of humor. Another sort of view about what makes things funny, this is defended by Thomas Hobbes, the superiority theory of humor. So that which is humorous is that which makes an individual feel superior to others. So if I watch somebody comedically slip on a banana peel, the reason that I laugh is because I feel superior to this person who was so stupid to slip on a banana peel. But again, it seems like there are limitations when it comes to the superiority theory. Namely, it wouldn't be able to explain why something, for example, a knock-knock joke is funny. Many knock-knock jokes don't seem to require that the individual who's listening to the joke is superior to the person who's telling the joke, or some fictional person that the person who's telling the joke is representing. Then we have the play theory of humor, which has been developed especially by evolutionary psychologists. So like Hurley and Dennett, they talk about the importance of play. So the thought behind that is the reason that we find things funny in the ways that we do is because we've evolved evolutionarily in certain ways to enjoy social cohesion with other people. And laughter and humor is a mechanism through which we can enjoy that kind of social cohesion with other people. Then there are the sort of like Freudian psychologist takes about relief and humor. So there are some people that believe that what makes something funny is that there's psychic tension that's built up in your head that needs to be released through laughter. And I think that the case of nervous laughter is particularly plausibly explained by the relief theory. And a more recent account of what makes things funny has been developed by Stephen Gimbel, and he calls his view of what makes things funny the cleverness account of humor. So there are 4 different conditions for Gimbel about what makes things funny. So the first is the individual who is engaging in a sort of kind of humorous demonstration, so maybe telling a joke, they would have to have the intention that what they are saying is a joke. They should want their joke to land in a certain kind of way. The second condition for what makes things funny for Gimbel is conspicuousness. So not only should it be the case that the individual who's telling the joke in fact has the intention that what they're saying is a joke, but that their intention should be reasonably conspicuous to individuals who hear the joke. Then there is the condition of playfulness for Gimbel, and he doesn't understand playfulness the way that play theorists about humor would understand it. Rather, he views playfulness as when you use something for a purpose other than what it was intended for. So a child eating a banana is not playing with the banana, but a child who holds a banana up to his ear and pretends that it's a phone is playing with the banana, according to Gimbel. And then lastly, and the most important condition for what makes things funny, according to Gimbel, is cleverness. And so he classifies cleverness as a cognitive virtue that is basically a skill that is useful in other domains of life. So being well-read, being able to make astute observations about the things happening around you, etc. But rather than using the virtue for a practical purpose, you're using the virtue for the sake of producing a work of art, namely a joke. And so for Gimbel, if somebody has the intention to tell a joke, their intention is somewhat conspicuous to the individuals listening to the joke. They're engaged in playfulness with respect to what the topic of the joke is, and they are exercising the cognitive virtue of cleverness, that seems to be what makes things funny. And so if we were to revisit one of the earlier accounts of what makes things funny, so for example, the incongruity account, we might pair the incongruity account with Gimbel's understanding of cleverness in order to resolve the issue of what kinds of incongruity are relevant to determining whether a joke is funny or not. So Gimbel's answer would be something like those incongruities that are the product of exercising the cognitive virtue of cleverness. So I think that especially if we consult what I take to be a really plausible account of what makes things funny, the cleverness theory of humor, that this thought that there might be something like objective comedic or humorous value is not super implausible. But beyond that, I want to clarify what I mean when I'm using the term objective, comedic, or humorous value, because I think that there are different ways that the term could be interpreted. And based on the way that you're interpreting it, my views are going to seem more or less plausible. So you might think that what makes something funny or humorous is some kind of disembodied, free-floating, unchanging value in the world, and that anytime there's a successful joke, that the joke is somehow related to that free-floating, unchanging value. I think that conceiving of the objective value of humorousness or comedy in that kind of way is just simply implausible. Rather, I think that it's more plausible to think of the objective value of humor in terms of whether the value of a humorous demonstration could be ascertained simply by like reflecting on your own sorts of internal processes when you hear a joke, versus whether there is something outside of your brain that is relevant to determining whether a joke is funny or not. There's this really nice passage in Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments where he talks about how somebody might tell a really great joke, but you might not laugh at the joke, even though you can recognize that the joke is a good joke, because you might be in some kind of like grave mood. Something bad might have happened to you earlier in the day. You might be sad. And so you might not be in a position to laugh at a good joke, even when it's told. If that sort of thing is true, and I think a lot of people, when reflecting on their own lives, will find that they have had moments like this, that it does seem that there are things about jokes, irrespective of the way that we feel about them, that could make a difference for the aesthetic value of the joke. I'm going to continue by talking about what I take the difference to be between humor or comedy and the values of coolness and sexiness that you had brought up. The first thing that I want to point out is that I don't think that like in principle, it seems completely implausible to say that there might be objective standards of coolness or sexiness. It's not an idea that I'm resistant to, but the idea that I would be resistant to is claiming that we should feel comfortable recognizing aesthetic value in those domains compared to the domain of humor or comedy. And so the reason for that would be that when we are assessing the aesthetic merits of a joke, we're not making any sort of judgment about the value of the person who made the joke. It might be that along an aesthetic dimension that they might be a better or worse joke teller, depending on the quality of their jokes, but they wouldn't necessarily be viewed as a better or worse person. But then in the case of like coolness and sexiness, first, there isn't like a product in those cases that is created by people that is distinguishable from the person themselves. Like if you think that somebody is cool or is sexy, you are talking about them, not something that they have made, for example, a joke. And so it seems to me that using normatively loaded terms to assign value to persons would be like morally objectionable in ways that it wouldn't be in the case of assigning value to jokes. So that would be the sort of distinction that I would want to make between coolness and sexiness and humor. For now, that's where I'll leave my responses to you. Thanks for that.
Just one quick follow-up, if I might. One is, so you said basically there's a product and there's a judgment and it separates them. But the concern about the morality is exactly what we're discussing, right? It can be the immoral jokes. Can there be immoral coolness or sexiness? So I'm not sure the moral concerns really distinguish the two, because this is precisely what we're discussing. And in terms of products, I have to respectfully disagree. Take as Bugs Bunny cool, which is a side note, he's very cool. There is a product. It's not an individual. We're not going to hurt Bugs Bunny's feelings, but we can certainly address whether or not Bugs Bunny is cool. If we're looking at whether the various heroes and anti-heroes in Sin City are sexy, we certainly can address that, even if they're 100% computer generated or something like that. So I think that morality doesn't distinguish it because, one, that's what's at issue, and nor does a product distinguish it, because we certainly can, and in fact we do discuss which cartoon characters or CGI characters are cool or sexy. So I'm just not seeing the distinction here. You might just say that, look, I think coolness and sexiness are objective, but I think that's a little bit different from saying that there's no product.
So at least in terms of the morality point that you're making, so the discussion that we're having is what the relationship is between morality and aesthetic value, right? Which is a separate question from how we should conduct ourselves in light of a particular relationship between aesthetics and morality. So it could be very well the case that I am right, that every time that there is a moral defect in a joke, that it is enhanced aesthetically. But it could also be the case that it would be morally wrong to tell jokes, even if they have been enhanced aesthetically along a particular dimension. My contention is, when it comes to the case of coolness and sexiness, that when we make aesthetic judgments regarding persons or their public personas themselves, oftentimes it's the case that ascription of aesthetic value is taken to be likewise an ascription of increased moral value. And to the extent that sort of hazard exists in the case of ascribing aesthetic value to persons' public personas, as compared to the minimal moral hazard that exists in ascribing aesthetic value to a joke, which is not a person and not connected to a person's public persona, that seems to be the relevant sort of difference that I'm trying to make between the cases.
So there's a great Jimmy Carr joke. Jimmy Carr is just fantastic at these little one-liners that kind of grow, and often you see the audience laughing in stages. And so the joke is this: he says, throwing acid is wrong, at least in some people's eyes. Now, why the joke is funny is you're playing with the term like in some people's eyes, and in other words, people might disagree about this, but there's also the idea of throwing acid into someone's eyes. And once we think about that case, we think about this being a genuine problem, right? There were many women in India who had acid thrown into their eyes for being immodest. So now we've got to determine, is the joke a moral joke or an immoral joke? Is it punching down? Is it making fun of this vulnerable class of women who've had acid thrown in their eyes? Is it some form of social commentary saying that you ought not to do this? So I wonder how we draw those distinctions. You gave us some indications of when a joke would be immoral, but you've also indicated that joking often is about play. And it seems that to take the joke teller literally is to fail to understand the format that you're in, that there may be some cases where comedians are playing multiple roles. So if I think about the work of George Carlin, a lot of it is telling jokes, but a lot of it was a proselytizing of sorts. It was to punt a particular message. And that often the joke was a medium for conveying some kind of political commentary, whether it's about the environment or about the role of the state or whatever it is, and along the way people laugh. And you might think that when there's a political message there that just happens to be a bit funny, then maybe you're got to subscribe to the ordinary norms of speech. But when we're just in the joke telling category where there isn't this proselytizing going on, then it seems that to take the person seriously is to have some kind of defect, to fail to appreciate what it is that you're consuming. And so I wonder what would make those kinds of cases actually immoral, and how do we work out the difference between the joke that talks about subject matter that's immoral and the joke that itself is immoral?
Yeah, this is a great question. I have a very complicated answer. So I want to first flag that my position is consistent with my saying that the jokes that I call immoral for my purposes might in fact turn out to be jokes that promote certain kinds of moral value. The reason for this is because the way that I understand an immoral joke is not in terms of whether the utterance of the joke comes into conflict with objective moral facts, but rather it's about whether the utterance of the joke comes into conflict with conventional norms of morality and propriety, regardless of whether those norms accord with objective moral facts. So it could be the case that an immoral joke teller, that is, a joke teller who is regarded by many in their society as immoral based on the jokes that they tell, that such a joke teller could actually be up to something really morally important through their joke telling if we were to just assess their joke telling in terms of whether it accords with objective moral facts. But that nonetheless, I think that it's important that we use the term immoral to describe the jokes that they're telling, at least for the purposes of talking about the aesthetic value of immoral jokes, because so many people take those individuals to be immoral because of the jokes that they tell. Some of what you were talking about with respect to somebody who takes a joke seriously might themselves have a defect. That reminds me a lot of a distinction, I want to say that it was made by Tony Veal, between bona fide and non-bona fide modes of communication. So a bona fide mode of communication is a mode of communication in which you seek to actually express views that you hold, and perhaps, hopefully, you hope to impinge those views onto others or to get others to understand that you hold those views. And a non-bona fide mode of communication would be a mode of communication in which you're not really trying to communicate anything serious. One might claim that many, if not all, instances of joke telling are instances of non-bona fide modes of communication. And to the extent that somebody has a moral reaction to a joke that was expressed through a non-bona fide mode of communication, that is a mode of communication in which nothing serious is trying to be communicated through the speech, that the individual who takes offense to that particular joke might not have the grounds to actually take offense to the joke, much in the way that if I were to have somebody in my family with advanced dementia who says something to me that if somebody who did not have advanced dementia were to say it to me would offend me, that would be irrational for me to take offense to that person and to expect that they owe me repair for having offended me.
So I'm curious as to you seem to suggest that some jokes are funnier because they're immoral, and you even seem to be open to the idea that all jokes are funnier because they're immoral. And I'm wondering about whether that makes any sense. Could the same joke be funnier when it's immoral as opposed to being moral when it wouldn't be the same joke? Let me give two jokes, neither which is appropriate or probably moral, but I just wonder if there's any version at which we can imagine the same joke in which was moral. The first joke is you can imagine a couple, and the couple is, and they, whenever something Jewish comes up, they both say, Jews, good husbands, bad wives. And this is an inside joke. They laugh each and every time, even though I don't know how funny that is. And second, they tell a joke at the expense of nurses. They tell the following joke. What's in between a nurse and a helicopter? Not everyone's been in a helicopter. Okay, so let's say you want to say, okay, so what would it look like if these jokes were moral, right? Would they be less funny? If morality is a necessary feature of people or of the relations between them, it would seem that there's no scenario under which these are moral jokes. But if there's no scenario in which of these moral jokes, then we can't say they're funnier because they are immoral, because there's no comparison to be made comparing when the one joke is told when it's moral and telling the same joke when it's immoral. So I'm not sure I understand that claim.
The response that I'm going to give, I suspect, is going to be satisfying in the sense that it's going to make you change your mind about your views if you aren't already sympathetic to my project. But I do think that my response is going to underscore a huge difficulty in the philosophy of humor that I think has gone underappreciated by people that think about these issues. I'll start off by talking about like methodology when it comes to talking about what theory of humor is the best theory of humor. So in the literature on humor, the approach that people take to convince others that a particular theory of humor is better than another is by giving a joke and then slightly modifying the joke such that a characteristic is taken out of the joke that is associated with a certain theory of humor. And then you try to say, okay, we took this characteristic out of the joke. The joke is either still funny or not funny. And because of that, we have either some reason for or against a particular theory of humor. So an example would be this example that Stephen gives. So there are two people sitting in the park, and one of them says, I know the names of all of the birds in this park. And the other person says, okay, what's the name of that one? And he was like, oh, the one with the red and yellow wings? And he said, yes. And then he replies, his name is Ralph. So there's that joke, right? So somebody might say, okay, if we're trying to figure out if incongruity is the thing that makes jokes funny, let's try to replace the punchline of Ralph with something else that's incongruous and see if the joke is still funny in virtue of its possessing incongruity. So imagine the same joke, but instead of the punchline being, his name is Ralph, the punchline is now, that's a washing machine. It seems that sort of response to the question is incongruous, but it doesn't actually make the joke funny. So somebody might think that because we've gone through that sort of method, that we have some reason to think that incongruity alone cannot explain why jokes are funny. But then there seems to be this question of, if we change the punchline from Ralph to that's a washing machine, is it even the same joke anymore? So I think that your concern would apply there as well. And if it applies there, it seems like one of the primary methods that people use to try to make cases about whether a particular theory of humor is successful or not would not be available to us anymore. And we should have something to make some progress on these issues. And that isn't to say that questions about the metaphysics of jokes aren't important. I think that they're incredibly important, and I think that there should be more attention paid to what makes one joke the same joke. But I just haven't given much thought to that particular question, and I hope that maybe explaining things in these terms at least gives you some pause about whether that sort of concern would be decisive against my arguments.
So one reason we might think that someone not laughing at a dark joke is that there's an aesthetic defect in them, that they lack the ability to appreciate these things. Another one might be to say that the joke has suffered because of its moral defect. So imagine this case. I build an absolutely glorious palace, okay, and I invite you to come visit it. And you walk around and you say, this is one of the most beautiful pieces of architecture I've ever seen in my life. I then change one thing about it, which is that the steps to the palace, I take a whole bunch of orphans and I put them behind the stairs, and then I nail their hands to the stairs. And so the only way that you can access the palace is to walk on the orphan's hands. And so it requires you to do this immoral thing, cause the orphan suffering, and that's the way that you'll be able to access the palace and enjoy its beauty. Now, you might think that the moral defect in the palace has an aesthetic knock-on, which is that it's now become harder to appreciate, and people have good reason not to appreciate the palace because to access it, they have to do this wrong thing. And so if I'm right about that situation, it might be that certain jokes require you to do something immoral to appreciate them aesthetically, that it's wrong to do the immoral thing, and that translates into an aesthetic defect.
Great. So DeArms and Jacobson, they talk about what they take to be a fallacy that a lot of people make when discussing the relationship between aesthetics and morality. And the fallacy is called the moralistic fallacy. So I think that in a case like that, where we suggest that because of a moral defect in a particular artistic demonstration, that suffices for making the artistic demonstration less aesthetically valuable, is mistaken, because there's a difference between the reasons that we have to publicly express admiration for a work of art and the reasons that we have to just recognize that the work of art is successful as a work of art. And so in the case of the palace with steps built by dead orphans or made up of dead orphans, I think that it would be completely appropriate for people to think we should not recognize this as a beautiful work of art because it's an atrocity. We should not write think pieces where we talk about how amazing this work of art is, etc. But those sorts of claims are different from the claim of whether the palace itself is beautiful and whether somebody has a reason to think that the palace is beautiful. So I think that we can still hold on to a lot of the judgments that we would like to make about immoral works of art without ceding that the fact that they are immoral actually tarnishes their aesthetic value. And I want to give an aside that I think is relevant to this, and in particular in the case of humor. So Ted Cohen, in his book on joking that he published in the 90s, he talks about how it's important for people who see a moral problem with immoral jokes to be honest about whether those jokes are funny, because he thinks that it can be precisely that those jokes are funny that compounds the moral issues associated with the joke. And so if we're just trying to be dishonest with ourselves and try to conflate any sort of immoral demonstration with being an aesthetically demeritorious demonstration, we might miss important information about what it is that makes the demonstration immoral to begin with. And so that's at least a reason to be especially cautious about committing the moralistic fallacy in these kinds of contexts.
So I have a question which takes the other variant, a variant on what Mark said. And my concern is why any jokes are immoral. So let me tell a joke that I'm ripping off from the 70s show Taxi. Imagine someone said, "Hey, is he Jewish or did he just have a pelican in the family?" Okay, so we say, okay, why is that an immoral joke? The explanation in terms of vulnerable group seems to be irrelevant. We care about a vulnerable group only because the group is going to be harmed or exploited. And the concern really there is with harm and exploitation. It's not with social vulnerability. That seems to be irrelevant. It could be because the person who told the joke has a character flaw, but why do we care about whether or not the joke has a character flaw? Because the character flaw comes out in terms of him telling a joke that's wrong in some way. So really, what makes a joke immoral, if it were to be immoral at all, is that it's wrong. Whereas you might put it lacks a justification. But what's the wrong maker? For example, on utilitarian terms, a joke that has a lot of people laughing is not wrong, no matter how on its face superficially mean-spirited it is. If everyone feels better because of it and no one feels worse, then there's nothing immoral about it on utilitarian terms. So you might think, okay, I'm a Kantian about what makes telling a certain joke wrong. Already we know you're on thin ice, but whatever. So someone might say that. But a Kantian has a real hard time explaining what makes a joke wrong. If I think a mean-spirited joke, if I think the pelican joke, it's a little hard to see how that treats someone merely as a means, or it can't be universalized. If I tell someone a joke and the person who it's aimed at is not around to hear it, it's a little, I don't even affect the person. It's a little hard to see how I treat that person violates some sort of Kantian imperatives. Now, if I say the joke when the person's around, it seems to be that what explains why it was wrong to say the joke when the person was around as opposed to when he was not is because it harms him. But then we're back to the harm-based explanation, and that just is a utilitarian consideration. So I guess my question is, why think that any jokes are immoral? Why aren't all jokes are moral and none of them touch your body or your stuff? Also, you might think some jokes are deserved, right? If someone makes a joke at Hitler while he's alive, you might think, that's a deserved joke. Okay, so it's not insult per se either. That is, I think there's no explanation as to why a joke is immoral, and hence the framing of the issue seems mysterious to me.
Somewhat paradoxically, I'm going to first preface this by saying I'm largely sympathetic to your analysis about whether jokes can be properly classified as immoral, in the sense that by telling the joke, you could be expected to make repair for having told the joke or something like that. I'm very sympathetic to that line of thought. But it does seem that there are certain kinds of jokes that are taken to be immoral by individuals, which is why I think these debates are even like live in philosophy. And so I think that we have to have some sort of starting point where we maybe come up with a disjunctive account, the way that I did, of the kinds of jokes that people ordinarily take to be immoral, and then trying to explain how the features of those jokes that people take to be immoral actually provide us with reasons to think that the jokes, while taken to be immoral for possessing those features, are likewise aesthetically enhanced because they possess those features. So like my claim about the relationship between morality and humor is not about objective morality and humor and its relationship, but rather conventional morality and humor and its relationship. And you might wonder to yourself, like, does it even make sense to call the position that I am defending immoralism? I think that given the context against which these debates are being held, it makes sense to call the kind of position that I'm defending immoralism, not in the sense that it's actually talking about ways in which jokes come into conflict with objective morality and on that basis are enhanced aesthetically, but rather the people that have a problem with immoral jokes seem to be making appeals to conventional morality to make the case that jokes are tarnished because they come into conflict with what conventional morality prescribes. So I agree with you that the way that I've gone about framing this issue, you might be confused by it at first glance, but I think that there's really no other way to tackle this issue such that we can actually account for the intuitions that people who are sympathetic to an immoralist position actually have, and those who are not sympathetic to an immoralist position, the intuitions that they have as well.
So just a quick follow-up. Why not say instead, look, if no joke telling is immoral, then yeah, the way the literature has framed the issue and the way the people I work with have framed the issue just reflects confusion, right? They should put down the crack pipe.
That definitely is one way of responding to all of the confusion. But then I would still be left with this like nagging concern about what it is about the kinds of jokes that everybody so clearly recognizes as immoral, even if in fact they are not. Like, what is it about those jokes that makes them so special to the people that enjoy them? I think that question would still exist, even if we gave the sort of response to the quandary that you're partial to. And I'm interested in that question. So that's how I fashioned my position to be able to address that question.
So Steve sets out two different ways in which a joke could be immoral, and it seems like we can cash out jokes that would meet either of those criteria. So the one is you tell a joke, and instead of it causing uproarious laughter, it causes immense amounts of distress, disdain, anger, fear, so negative utility. On that grounds, on a utilitarian basis, it's an immoral joke. The other one would be that you tell a joke at someone's expense in front of them to make other people laugh. So you use them as a means to an end. So when I'm at a party with Steve, I say, Steve's not actually Jewish. He's just got a pelican as a granddad. And everybody laughs. And Steve's like, I've been teased since I was a 6-year-old about my big fucking nose. And I really don't appreciate it when you make jokes like that. And he's like really upset. I've used them as a means to an end. So it seems like we could have this. I wonder about something else though, which is, should we give comedians extra leeway? So comedians seem like at the moment they're under a lot of threat. If we think about Chris Rock getting slapped on a stage, Dave Chappelle climbed on the stage, try to beat him up. It seems like comedians are now in this space where they want to be able to say certain things. They're not just concerned about being canceled, having their careers over because they told a joke that didn't land, but that they could be physically assaulted. Do we need to change the culture around how people receive comedy so that you can say, look, people should be able to make mistakes. Sometimes the joke's not going to land. Sometimes it is going to cause more suffering than it causes joy. Sometimes it is going to be at the expense of someone who uses them as a means to an end, but that's okay. That's an important part about comedy. And that's why I'm allowed to make jokes about Steve's cock nose.
So we're being taken off the course of just focusing on questions of like aesthetics and humor with your question there. So all of the sorts of suggestions that I'm going to be making are tentative, first pass sort of suggestions, and also maybe just like laying out how one might go about responding to the question that you just asked. There's first like this question that somebody would have to consider between what sorts of trade-offs are tolerable between the promotion of moral value and the promotion of aesthetic value. If it's the case that we sometimes have reason to promote aesthetic value at the expense of moral value, that maybe we should try to come up with ways that people could be more receptive to jokes that might offend them, because presumably if such jokes have aesthetic value of some kind and they have enough to justify maybe suffering some costs in terms of promoting moral value, then we would have a reason to try to correct the way that people respond to offensive comedy. So that's one question that seems to be relevant to giving an answer to the question that you asked. Another question that seems relevant is one that we were just talking about before, about like, to what extent are jokes that are claimed to be immoral actually immoral? And how many of the bad consequences associated with telling those jokes, even if those consequences don't stem from immorality, should we tolerate? That question might also be relevant to providing an answer to the question that you asked. I am of the mind that especially professional comedians that have gone through the ringer, so to speak, and have really fine-tuned their comedic abilities are really important for a healthy society. I think that such individuals test the boundaries of our understandings of conventional morality and propriety, and in healthy ways that are like jovial and that don't result in violence to others. I think the idea of the court gesture in the modern day, we could definitely use people like that, that are smart and incisive about critiquing institutions of power. So I do think that given that there is this like really these important values that comedians are capable of promoting, that perhaps individuals have some reason, if not morally, at least prudentially, to not respond with such hostility to comedians that offend them. That's at least my sort of view. Do either of you have like different views with respect to that issue?
So I'm wondering why valid consent doesn't apply. When people complain about, even if jokes are immoral, you might think that certain times you validly consented to things. If you turn porn on your computer and you say, I'm offended at the sexuality I'm seeing, you consented to it. Or if you appear on Brain in a Vat and people are viciously attacking your sensible ideas, you might think, look, you consented to it. Or you show up to jiu-jitsu practice and someone like chokes the hell out of you. You're like, oh, wow. So why, in a lot of cases, why haven't people consented to making otherwise immoral jokes perfectly moral? If you were to show up to hear Andrew Dice Clay decades ago tell his jokes through his nursery rhymes, and you said, hey, that's really offensive. It's misogynist and it's homophobic. Well, yeah, that's what Andrew Dice Clay does. What exactly? So why doesn't the immorality disappear in virtue of valid consent?
Yeah.
And why don't we tell people complain about the Dave Chappelle comedy specials? What are you, an idiot? Turn it off.
Yeah, that's at least when it comes to those kinds of displays. Like, I'm glad that you brought up the Dave Chappelle comedy special. I remember after the Sticks and Stones special, all of the people that were writing these nasty things about the special, they were either people who had watched the special, in which case I thought to myself, why didn't you just turn it off if it was making you that upset? Or it was people who did not watch the special, but still wanted to have opinions about it. So I'm very much, again, sympathetic to this line of thought. But I do think that there are at least some cases, for me personally, where even if people are all acting within their rights, that sometimes there's a moral remainder or some like moral residue that is still bothersome to me. And so if it's the case, and I'm not saying that this has to be the case in the context of humor, but I am sympathetic to if, for example, on the internet, you come across a Dave Chappelle bit from a special as you're scrolling on Twitter and you weren't expecting to come across that. And you just needed to watch 5 seconds of it to get maximally offended by the special. It seems like in a case like that, there's something potentially bothersome from somebody's perspective about just having this sort of immoral humor just broadcasted to everybody without any kind of trying to bottleneck who actually sees it, such that the sorts of consent considerations that you were appealing to would actually go through. But that's like the only reason that I would have some sort of hesitation with respect to taking the consent line in this particular domain, which isn't to say that it's like a decisive reason to think that you're wrong, but it's just a hesitation I have.
So I have this thought as well, which is, it seems like there's a certain method that should be used when you're determining the value of a work of art. And part of it would be to engage with it properly. Imagine that you just took out the sex scenes from some of the cinematic greats and you just showed them on their own, and you showed them to people and you said, see, this stuff is pornographic. So you've missed the point, that if you look at the broad context of that film, maybe there's a small intention to cause sexual arousal, but there's so much more going on. And one of the things about a comedy special, it's easy to go and take out the 30-second joke and display that on its own. And there's a sense in which you're doing a disservice to the comedian and to the joke. Often what's done is that there's an hour-long build-up of building trust with your audience, of escalating things slowly, so that once you tell that killer joke, everybody knows all the prior reference points. As you mentioned, there's a sort of social language that happens with joke telling, and you've laid all that groundwork in the first hour. So when you tell that joke, the audience finds it hilarious because you've put in the work. And to just separate the joke out seems unfair. One of the things that happened to Louis C.K., for example, when he was canceled, was to take out various jokes from his sets, to change the background music to make it like sad music, and show that Louis C.K. was really confessing throughout his career about his views on women and masturbation, and it was really the ravings of a person who was psychotic as opposed to someone telling jokes. And it seems like there's something wrong about that approach when you want to try and assess the humor of the joke by cutting it up, by displacing it, by changing the context. And so maybe when we're trying to work out, is a joke moral, immoral, you can't just look at it on its own. You've got to look at it in the social context at the time, and maybe within that particular performance. And then you can make the assessment.
Again, this all sounds plausible to me, but I will express a particular kind of reservation that I have with taking that line of reasoning to an extreme. So one of the reasons that I give for thinking that immoral jokes of certain kinds are aesthetically valuable in ways that people overlook is because we could imagine the same joke being told by somebody different and people thinking that the joke is funny. So the example that I gave in a paper where I talk about these issues is that of a very obviously gay man calling a gay friend of his a faggot in an endearing way, and how a lot of gay people might think that is hilarious. But then if we were to change the obviously gay man with a dyed-in-the-wool heterosexual fraternity brother, and they were to call their gay friend a faggot endearingly, likely ears would perk up. And so I give those sorts of cases as a reason to think that there isn't like a problem with the joke and the aesthetic value of the joke. It's that people are having a moral response to the joke teller that stands in their way of rendering an accurate aesthetic verdict when it comes to the joke. So I do believe that like social context matters for assessing the aesthetic merits of a joke, but that if we were to say that like social context mattered to such an extent that somebody different telling the same joke would make a difference for whether the joke in fact is funny, even though we have good reason to think that it would be funny in both contexts, that sort of fine-grained analysis seems implausible to me. So the extent to which context matters for determining the aesthetic value of a joke, I think, is not maximal.
So in your response to Mark and in general, you seem to argue that we have good reason to believe, at least plausible, that aesthetic value is objective and that humor value is a type of aesthetic value. So it's that last claim that I'm not sure I see. So I'm going to tell two quick jokes that I find to be aesthetically unappealing. And I just don't think they're aesthetically appealing or have an aesthetic objection, but they arguably have humor value, maybe not very much. But the first joke is, did you hear about the German oven? It seats 4. All right. The second joke is, what's a female lawyer's most effective form of birth control? Her personality. Okay. So I'm not sure I see that either one of these is beautiful in any way. You might think they're ugly. You might think they're unfunny, but you might think they're ugly. But even if you think things can be aesthetically appealing, even if they are in some sense ugly, things like the movie, The Raging Bull or The Deer Hunter, still, it's a little hard to see that those jokes have the sort of sublime aesthetic value that these movies do. So I guess I just don't see humor value as a type of aesthetic value. So for your approach to work or be plausible, it would seem to me that I think a better position would be to say that humor value is objective and then it's distinct from aesthetic value.
I want to resist that a lot. It seems to me that if we're using the term beauty in a non-context sensitive way, that the term beauty to describe like a painting and a film and a sculpture or whatever, it seems like I don't have like a clear idea of what it is that unites all of those things that we call beautiful, especially if we have the sort of connotation that is culturally associated with beauty. But then if we were to like narrowly tailor our understanding of what beauty is sensitive to the domain that we are interested in examining. So for example, in horror, an aesthetic merit in a horror film is not going to be the same sort of thing that would count as an aesthetic merit in a rom-com. And so likewise, it seems to me that even if the sorts of jokes that you pointed to, they're not like beautiful in the sense that I would think the Mona Lisa is beautiful, if I even think that the Mona Lisa is beautiful, but it would be beautiful for a joke to be successful in the ways that jokes can be. And then the reason perhaps you might think that the jokes that you told are not beautiful is maybe because you don't think they're that great of jokes. And if you don't think that they're great jokes, then that's like completely consistent with saying that humor is a kind of aesthetic enterprise. It just so happens that the instances that you pointed out were instances of humor that were aesthetically demeritorious rather than aesthetically meritorious.
But I'm guessing in virtue of what are the jokes and the movies that I mentioned all beautiful? I understand that you say, look, I don't want to distinguish them. It's just a different type of beauty. And I understand that you're saying that, look, I can't tell you in virtue of what some funny movie, Talladega Nights, has in common with The Deer Hunter. But I'm still not seeing in virtue of what they're all beautiful. In addition, if they are all beautiful, why isn't sexiness and coolness then a type of beauty? It seems that beauty is either too broad or too narrow.
The thing that would be the answer to the question of what makes those things beautiful would depend on what sort of account of what makes funny you subscribe to. Given that I'm partial to somewhat of a pluralist account, but also I really think that the cleverness theory of humor is extremely valuable, that would be the sort of thing that I would point to say, all jokes are going to share these particular features of the person intending to tell the joke. They're conspicuous to greater or lesser degrees, etc. And that all of those features are present in all of these things that we call jokes. And those are the success conditions for determining whether a joke is beautiful, that is funny, given that funniness or amusement is the providence of humor.
Well, Connor,